Good evening. This is the meeting of the Plymouth Charter Commission, coming to you live from the Great Hall, also available by PAC TV and on Zoom. This meeting is being recorded. It's a hybrid meeting. If you were attending on Zoom and you wish to speak, just raise your hand that is on your panel on your Zoom desktop. If you're here in person, just register at the podium to speak. And public comment tonight, as it is on every night, will be at 8:30. We will start tonight's meeting with a Pledge of Allegiance.
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. We have also in attendance by Zoom are the consultants from the Collins School of Public Management. Welcome. I thought tonight we'll pick up where we left off at our last meeting, which was in Chapter 3 of the Charter. We were reviewing the Select Board. I'd like to finish the Select Board tonight, and we'll go on to the planning, and then we have some other items we need to cover, as well as one of them being the tracking chart, which Michelle has been keeping since we started our deliberations a year ago. It's a 3.5-page spreadsheet of dozens of items which came up as we've been reviewing other charters. I want to go through the list tonight to see which items you think should be put aside for further comment or discarded at this time. I just want to keep all the options on the table. So we'll go through this color-coded spreadsheet hopefully before the night is up. So the first item we want to talk about is the Select Board.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, who's speaking? Larry? Larry Pizer, go ahead.
Yes. Are you planning to bring up the issue originated by Mr. Cirque tonight?
No.
Thank you.
I think we need to do some further research before we bring it back. It will be brought back to the commission. I anticipate it will probably be the next meeting or the meeting after that. But there's some additional factual information and research that the Collins folks were going to provide to us regarding that particular issue. For anybody who's wondering what we're talking about the conflict of interest rules in our current charter, as well as the role of town employees in our municipal government. So on to the Select Board. The first item I don't think is controversial. We were looking to see how we could further define the Select Board's chief function. And we have 3 or 4 drafts here of different options. Betsy Hall furnished a couple that have been passed out. I know they've been in your packet, which defines the functions. And then I did find the one I was looking for, which was in the Bill Rickett Charter. And Betsy's given us one from the Chelmsford Charter, what's interesting is when you read all of them together, they have common language. There's almost like a common provision that must be in all these charters. The same words are used in terms of the functions of the Select Board, but they have a little bit of different spin or a little bit of different detail. The one that I found in the Bill Rickett Charter has much of the same language as Betsy's, but let me just read it very quickly. It says the executive powers of the town should be vested in the Board of Selectmen, which shall have all the executive powers given to boards of selectmen by general law or otherwise. That's pretty standard. But then it goes on to say, the Board of Selectmen shall serve as the chief policy-making agency of the town, responsible for the issuance of policy directives and guidelines to be followed by all town agencies serving under it. Providing, however, and this is the language which was unique to their charter, and I think it has some merit for Plymouth, provided, however, that no individual member of the Board of Selectmen nor a majority of them shall at any time attempt to become involved in the day-to-day administration of the affairs of the town. It is the intention of this provision that the Board of Selectmen shall act only through the adoption of policy directives and guidelines which are to be implemented by officers and employees appointed by or under its authority. So I suggest that we may want to fine-tune this or edit it. I'll put this in everybody's mailing for this next meeting. So if you have any edits to the language that you receive, let's finish it up at our next meeting. But that's basically the thrust of it. Any comment or questions? Betsy?
I just want to say that I am very much in favor of adopting some type of language. The Chelmsford says, "The daily administration of the affairs of the town shall be the exclusive responsibility of the town manager." I think that sentence plus another sentence, like from Bill
Yeah,
Erica.
I encourage you to go ahead and put your edits on it when you get it. And
Okay,
we'll put
do
it
you
all
want us
together.
to send them to you?
Pardon me?
Do you want us to email the edits to you?
Yeah, just email it to
I mean,
Michelle.
to
and
Michelle,
she'll
yep,
send it out.
okay.
So you'll be sending out what you read?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Because it certainly sounded good, and you're right, it sounded very similar to the other language we had in front of us.
It is similar. It's a little more specific,
But
but
I will say I liked the sound of it.
I'll send it out. The next item I think we should spend some time on is the actual formation of the select board, because this is kind of a big item. You know, we got into it at our last meeting, how the select board would be organized, and it was discussed that perhaps a couple members of the select board would perhaps be regional, representing areas of the town. But the actual details we didn't agree on. We just discussed it in concept, whether we have a larger select board, if it was to be partly regional and partly at large, but we really need to decide that tonight. So let's just have a discussion. And Collins, people, if you've got anything to add to it at this point from our last meeting, please do chip in. So, Betsy.
Yes, I would like us where some of us are very strongly one way and some of us are very strongly the other. I would like us to actually write down a list, have people say that what they consider to be the benefits of keeping the select board elected the way it is. And I want to remind people, we're not talking about anything about a town council at all, but we are looking at the possibility of an election that might look something like a town council election. So we're not talking about changing the select board's function in any way. So I think we could, those people who are very strongly for keeping it the way it is could tell us what they think the benefits are, and we could write those down. And then those people who are strongly against, keeping it the way it is and want to change it to more a variety of district and at large, could say what they think the benefits are. And also, what are the liabilities with each choice?
Why don't we first, before we spend a lot of time on this, let's just discuss whether we have a majority that's interested in making substantial, substantive changes to the way the board is currently set up. Because I think, Betsy, you would like to discuss this.
Yeah, I would like to talk
There's
about
one. Okay, Presley? And David? You would like to discuss it? And David? Okay, looks like it's a subject. And Scott? Talk about the makeup of the select board.
Yeah, I thought, Frank's not here, and he's.
Right. I don't think Frank's not going to be able to join us tonight. He's not feeling well.
Frank was the one who proposed it.
Right. So why don't we discuss it, though? I think since Frank proposed it, we know where he basically stands on it.
Bill Cohen also had some strong feelings about it, if
Pardon
I
me?
recall. Bill Cohen also had some strong feelings about it as well, if I remember.
Yeah, Bill expects to be here in about a half an hour.
I see. Maybe we could wait till Bill arrives to talk about
Well,
this?
why don't we kick off the discussion?
All right.
David?
Perhaps, is it worth, because it sounds relatively unique, at least to my ear, with this idea of the select board, ask Collins if there are other examples around the state.
Mike, I know you've told us this a couple of times, that basically you found Situate as being the
Yeah,
only example?
That's the only one we're aware of. In 1972, they moved to a select board with a mix of at-large and district. And then at some point, we believe during the 80s, they reverted back to the more common, or I guess otherwise nearly universal, all at large. It's not, I mean, I can't say that there's never been any others, but that's the only one our team collectively was aware of.
But right now, currently, they're back to all at large, right?
Did somebody, anybody else have a comment?
That was a question.
What?
I was had a question for.
I don't see anybody up on the Zoom that would like to speak. Anybody on the panel would like to add their comments? David?
Scott would like to ask Mike.
Scott, go ahead.
Yeah, that was a question for Mike.
What's the question?
Mike, can you hear me?
I can now. I didn't hear the question before, though. Sorry.
So my question is that now Situate's the only one you found, but that right now, everybody is at large. There are no other communities in Massachusetts with districts or.
As far as we know, and I mean, is it possible there's one it would have to be pretty far out from Greater Boston, I think. Otherwise, we would have heard of it. So as far as we know right now, there are none. In fact, to go even further, as far as we know right now, all select boards are either 3 or 5, with the exception of Wakefield, which is 7. And Wakefield is also unique in that they decided a couple years ago they wanted to rename it away from Board of Selectmen, and instead of following Select Board as many towns have, they decided to rename their Select Board a Town Council, even though it is actually a Select Board. And it's 7 members, and all others that we are aware of are
So-
3 or 5.
Michelle, did you finish, by the way, the minutes from the last meeting? I'm just wondering, didn't we take a couple of like preliminary votes on this particular issue? And one of them, if my memory's right, didn't we vote on whether we wanted to keep it at 5 or more than 5 last week?
I don't remember.
Okay, we could certainly
That-
repeat it tonight.
That may have been in your June 9th minutes that you had
One
last
from last
week.
Thursday night, which is the 23rd of,
Yeah, Bill, we never took a vote because Frank was speaking on it last meeting, and that's where all the numbers,
started the
the
discussion.
numbers
Okay,
were
we
all
could
flying
certainly-
around, but we never had a vote on it.
so how do we feel about numbers and who they represent? Wrestling.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting conversation because I think, from the beginning, we've talked about really digging deep into the charter and, like you have said, putting the patient on the operating table, not just, nitpicking. And I think that it's an interesting concept of having people represent different sections of town. And I, there are pluses and minuses, like Betsy said. Part of the concern of the public is that they don't feel like they're well represented under the current situation. And I don't know how you can, I see big difficulties with having, people from one section running. But I also think it would be interesting to see a select board that had a broader span of the town representing them. So that's a wish-washy way of saying it, but I think it's an interesting concept. I don't know if I'm in favor of, having, you either got to say, all right, we're going to have a select board that represented a different section of town or not. And I think that I would be in favor of more selectmen persons, only in the fact that I think that it would bring out a broader array of people. And it's because I think that we're getting less and less people running. And it would be nicer to see a broader spectrum of people.
So Leslie, just to summarize, you'd like to see more selectmen, but not necessarily representing specific areas.
I think it's a great discussion, but I don't see how it could work.
Right.
And I'd love, I'd love to hear from,
I think everybody
Bill or anybody.
tonight should really speak on this point, so we just know where we're all at. David?
Yeah, I'm going to say, I am in favor of continuing to talk about it, and I would be supportive of it conceptually, but, it goes hand in hand with, I believe, a larger select board is worth also pursuing, in part because I would like to define the supermajority for major decisions of a kind of a higher number of select board. However, knowing that with a spring election and most precincts vote at 10 or 12%, but one or two precincts consistently vote 2 or 3 or 4 times at a higher rate, that truth runs the risk that, 1 or 2 precincts who are exercising their democracy have certainly more clout than the rest of the town. So I would like to continue to pursue the idea of a mix of representative and at-large selectmen. I'm still intellectually convinced, even though you should also learn from history, and our Collins friends have told us that doesn't exist. So I
Wait,
also like to listen to that advice and that
So
reality on the ground.
you're still contemplating a geographic,
Yes, it's a mix of geographic
Right.
and at-large, and a larger select board.
right, okay. Let's see, David. Yes,
I see no benefit of increasing the number of selectmen. There is already a supermajority, it's 4. So if you make it 5 of 7, you haven't changed anything radically. We have instances where you need a supermajority, and 4 it is. I don't think there's such a workload that you need 7 selectmen, and that's evident by the fact that only one town, Wakefield, and they're really not a board of selectmen, they're a council.
Just call me now.
Yeah. Now, when you talk about area selectmen, I am vehemently opposed to that. I think the way it has been ad infinitum and the way it is throughout all of the towns that the Collins people investigated, I think I just kicked somebody's. You have a situation, a selectman needs to represent the whole town, and you have to spread your decision-making over the whole town. And the only way you can do that is if you represent the entire town. This business about having district selectmen, I don't agree with it. It's never been something that's been done in the past, and I don't think we should go that route now. Now, you say it might draw out more voters. I think the only way you can draw out more voters is put a food truck at every precinct and give away free hot dogs. Because having more candidates for different areas and districts and things like that, I don't think it's going to accomplish what you want. I think we should stay the way we are, 5 selectmen, and I think they should be at large, because I think that's your best governing method.
Scott, you want to let us know where you are at this?
Yeah, I think it's kind of funny that we're coming full circle on the town council, because this is what we talked about with the town council. And, I mean, just call it what it is. If we're going to increase the number of selectmen and we're going to turn it geographically, then it's a town council. So either we want to revisit that discussion again, which I wouldn't mind revisiting that discussion again, or we don't. And that's kind of how it is, because we start conceptually with yes or no, we want to change the number, and then after that, it's okay. So how do we divide the town up? How do we develop these wards or whatever we're going to call them for the geographic? So it's a rabbit hole that we're either going to go down or we're not going to go down, and we need to
Scott,
decide whether we're going to do
Let's just
it.
say we have an executive body, whatever it is, and whatever it's called, forget what it's called, do you have, like the idea of geographic representation?
Bill, do you
And
have
more
your
than
mic on?
5 people?
Bill, you have your mic on. You're not talking to me.
Geographic representation of the different select, of the.
Yes, I voted in favor of the town council, and that's what we were talking about. So it's the same concept, so yes, I was in favor of it.
So, more than 5.
But now we're just calling it a different name.
Right. And Betsy,
Scott, are you aware that we are not changing the function and the responsibilities of the select board?
Yes, and when we talked about a town council, they're the executive branch of the government, it's the same thing.
No, it's not, because they're also the legislative branch, town council. I think that it's really so important, we're all completely clear that a town council in Barnstable or Amherst is both the executive and the legislative branch. We're not talking about that at all here. So I think we need to be really clear, we're not talking about a town council.
So we're talking about the hybrid model that we discussed.
No, we're not. We're just talking about a way of election. We're
An
just talking
executive
about
branch.
A form of election. We're not talking
Well, I
about
think-
an executive branch and a legislative branch being the same 7 or 9 people.
but I have an idea what Scott's saying. He wants an executive board with geographic representation and more than 5, which could also be called a council. It doesn't really matter what you call it.
It doesn't matter,
There's
but I
still a
just want to
town
be
meeting
sure
that's going to make a legislative
that everybody
decision.
understands the
Right.
function of this select, we're going to call it the select board, it's going to keep the same function. The
So-
discussion is about how to elect
So
them.
Betsy, where do you stand on this?
You know, one of the things that I'm very fortunate to have lots of friends in all the different precincts, and particularly in the precincts that are extremely well organized. And they have an enormous advantage, and that is that everybody has everybody else's email address. In my precinct, we've never had that. I'd have to go around and knock on every door and get everybody's address, an email address. But there are some areas of town where everyone can communicate instantly about everything, which is an enormous advantage. And maybe there's some way we can do that with all the precincts at some time in the future. But this allows a particular group of people who are wonderful people and they're doing wonderful work for our town to have maybe a little more ability to communicate quickly than maybe, say, the North Plymouth does or West Plymouth does. So I'm only putting that out as something to think about, along with this idea of having, maybe every 3 precincts is a district. I could write down some of the benefits that I know, that I think of when I think about having people elected from maybe we'll call it a district. And that is that it's much less expensive to operate in 3 precincts rather than the entire town. When I looked at the campaign finances for one of our select board members, it was like $40,000 over 2, yeah. We never saw anything like that in this town before, over the 2 elections, the initial election to get elected to that temporary position. And then, so I know it was probably at least $20,000. Many people don't have that kind of money or the ability to raise that kind of money. So if a person like I'm not going to run for the select board, but if I were to be running from 3 precincts, I would only have to send postcards or put up signs or whatever in that one area. I wouldn't have to raise that kind of money, and the people in my precinct area would know me better than as an at-large person. So I think there are definitely assets and liabilities to this plan, and I think we need to weigh them both out and say, these benefits outweigh those liabilities.
So Betsy,
And
you're in
I certainly
favor-
hear what David is saying, there are some
So
liabilities,
you're in
but
favor of selectmen? different
I
areas?
see this hybrid sort of
Okay,
election
how about
in
the
which some
number
people.
of selectmen?
I think 7 would be a good number.
7?
As wrestling has said several times, we're looking for the most democratic form of government. So, and I wouldn't be opposed to 5, but I think that spreading it out between precincts would be a good idea. And how we separate that out, how we delineate what those districts will be another discussion.
okay.
But I can see benefits, yes, I can definitely see benefits. Not to changing the policies and so forth of the select board, not changing the function, but just talking about how many and how to elect them.
That's right. So, Larry Pizer,
Larry's up there.
go ahead, Larry.
Facing the danger of agreeing with David Malakuti, I have to say that the complaints that I've heard previously that people have been elected, in particular town meeting representatives with very few votes, is something that we would have to face if we were going to have district elections. There's no reason to believe that just because there was a district that there would be a higher turnout. So the idea of having representation is a good one, but the idea that we have someone to represent the entire town is an even better one. We have people representing districts, those who call town meeting representatives, and right now we have people representing the town of Plymouth. That is the select board. Also like to point out that, not that this is a wonderful number, but we exceeded 17% at the last election. Rather, it's not 10 or 12% that some people were talking about. Thank you.
Thank you. So I just comment that Frank had this idea, so I assume he's going to be perhaps still in favor of it. And Bill Cohan at the last meeting expressed that he was in favor of everybody being at large. So I'd say we're about evenly split. So why don't we, unless you have anything further to add at this point, we'll break this down at the next meeting into two basic votes, number of selectmen and whether they're at large or partly area, and decide it one way or the other. But right now, I think we're almost evenly split. David?
Yeah, I just was going to say, I think we should wait till we get our
Right.
full membership here in person.
So this would be something we do in the
I
meeting
agree.
on the 11th? Right, David?
Well, I just want to say, and I don't want to be belligerent to my good friend Betsy, but if you are putting signs up in your precinct, if you are sending cards in your precinct, if you're running in your precinct, or groups of precincts, then you're telling me your allegiance is to those precincts.
Okay. So we put out advance warning, we're going to vote this at our next meeting. A couple more things in the select board chapter. One thing we talked about was setting up a separate licensing board. Do we still think that makes sense to take a minuscule or a ministerial duty away from the select board? That's just David.
Yeah, I'm going to say, I'm absolutely in favor of that.
Pardon
You
me?
know, I'm totally in favor of creating
Okay.
a separate licensing group. You know, we heard about it from
Right.
the other towns. You know, we've seen it in other charters. I think that lightens up the sort of day-to-day agendas of the select board so they can focus more on,
Right.
on policy. So I would love to see us.
I think we're all in agreement on that. Is there any opposition? Or Betsy, you want to add something?
I'm not in opposition, I'm for it, but I meant to say, before we went on to this, that I'd like to see if the Collins group has any
Okay.
comments to make on the
Mike, do you wanna have a-
discussion we had just previous to this one.
Mike, I'm not sure you were here with that night. We discussed this licensing board as a way to take
No,
some
no,
of this.
I mean, I would like them to comment on the election of the select board and how many select board, that whole conversation. Just before we go on to licensing, did they have any comment about that?
You okay with that?
And if they don't, that's okay, if they don't have any, but I didn't want to lose that.
Well, Mike, is there anything you want to add to that, or we just keep asking you, and basically we have Situate as an example?
Yeah, I don't have anything really to add at the moment, other than to say, I think everyone did a good job of articulating the pretty broad list of both pros and cons on both sides.
Right.
And so, you know, I think that was a good discussion, and, you know, I anticipated it will continue. I guess the only thing I would say is a point of clarity to address this council issue. Sorry, I shouldn't have even brought up Wakefield. So in Wakefield, the select board is still the executive branch as it is, as all other select boards are. They chose to confuse things, in my opinion, a little bit by taking what is typically a legislative title and slapping it on the executive. I understand why they did it, but they're unique in that front. So I shouldn't have, sorry to even introduce that. My understanding of what you're doing here is in no way changing the executive function of the select board. And so, I'm glad that that was cleared up a bit. Yeah, I mean, we'll keep looking in to see if there's any other, record. But to this point, we haven't seen any. I don't know, Libby, do you have anything else to add to this?
I mean, we discussed or at least provided some guidance in the memo that we provided at the last meeting. So I would refer to that. But in terms of policy decisions and what might be right for Plymouth, that's really not for us to comment on, or at least I don't feel that that's my role.
Okay, thank you.
So Betsy, it may be kind of thin gruel, but we'll see what they have to say at the next meeting. But as far as the licensing board, Mike, this is a
Mr. Chairman?
proposal we would like to develop. Yes, David?
I think we should check also on attendance on the July 11th meeting, because I know two of us, have a competing call on us on a personal side that we may need to balance. I'm talking about me and Larry have been invited to a 50th anniversary of very good friends we've known for 50 years, and it's calling to us. So I think we should also check our likely attendance or the time of discussion a little bit, because
Who is unable to be at the meeting on the 11th?
Well, what I'm saying is I and Larry Pizer have a, invitation to a conflicting event on that evening. And we are both wrestling, I think, I don't want to speak for Larry, but wrestling with the, our call to, join a family we've known for 50 years, as opposed to coming, we're going to be torn. And so I just want to acknowledge what kind of attendance we're going to have, either later this evening. So,
Mr. Chairman,
Hi, Larry. Yes.
I'm wondering if we could move the meeting up a half hour or an hour, so that if the meeting were to start at 7:30 rather than 7, it might make it more likely that David and I could attend at least most of the meeting.
Okay, David, does that sound doable?
yeah, that sounds
Michelle, we
fine.
could do that? Okay. Sounds like something we can.
Good idea, Larry.
All right, solved.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
Bill?
Scott?
Yeah, just back to licensing real quick. When we started talking about taking this responsibility and putting onto a licensing board, the only thing I'd want to make sure is that we left an appellate review. So if somebody had a license denied by this board, that they would have the ability to appeal that to either the Board of
Yeah,
Selectmen or
that's a
some
good
type of.
point, that we would want that checked out, Mike, right? To keep the same legal process. Yep, thank you.
Good idea. Bill, if I recall, maybe somebody else will remember, when Amherst came to speak to us, they said that they had done this and that they had put this in their charter. Does anyone else remember that? That charter? So we might want to look at that Amherst charter for language.
Right, they did.
Yeah, Barnstable has it as well, but both of those are councils and not, select board, town meeting form of government. So that might be something to ask Collins to, find other towns that have licensing boards as part of.
Collins is hearing you and shaking your head yes.
The,
Yeah, did you guys hear what I said? Okay.
Bill?
Thumbs up for
Bill? Another, along with an appellate process for the issuance of a license is, a lot of times we'll have, licensed premise that wind up having a disciplinary action against them, or a suspension of a license or something like that. So we'd also want to be very clear on whether that would go to the selectmen or whether that would be retained by this licensing board. You know what I mean? And what type of appellate review that would take as well, because I know we have had problems where the selectmen have instituted discipline.
Select board would sort of be like a preliminary hearing in a situation that's contested like that. and the select board-
Is your mic on?
Bill, is your mic on?
Mike, did you hear that question?
Sorry, I
Scott raised the point of the legal process with a licensing board, where there is an appellate right from it. And I'm just wondering how you view this would work in practice. Would the licensing board come up with a decision, but it would be subject to the select board could basically overrule it or decide contrary?
Let us come up with, bring you a couple examples of how other towns do it, and give you some options to choose from at the next meeting. How about that?
Okay.
Mike, just to clarify, there was a two-part question. One was the issuance of a license, and the other one was a licensed premise that comes up for some type of disciplinary action. Like if we say hypothetically there was a bar downtown that became a nuisance and was in violation of their licensing guidelines, and the board was to take disciplinary action against them, such as a suspension or something, or revocation of their license. Would the licensing board do that, or the selectmen? And if it was the board, would there be an appellate review by another body like the selectmen? Just to clarify the question.
Good question.
Got it, great. Yeah, we'll put all that together into a memo.
And the other question was, is it only towns with a town council? Well, that was your question, David. Was it
Well-
only towns with a town council that have these licensing boards, or also towns with select boards? That was the other question? I think that you raised that.
Yeah.
Focus first on select board form.
Right.
And look for good examples that might be interesting. Only if we can't find any will we bring you some of the council manager
Yeah,
equivalents.
I will say, I could circulate it, Amherst does have
Right, they do.
quite a bit, and they sort of empower the building inspector and the public health and the fire chief and the police chief to also, comment and participate in the process. And there's a lot of references to the general law. So I know Amherst appears to have a pretty good sample, but that,
Yes, we'll
again,
look at Amherst.
yeah, it's,
Right.
Yeah, we can include them. That is a council manager form, but we can certainly include them as well.
All right, good. One thing I'd like to mention, we'll spend a couple of minutes on it, that the town manager did go through the charter, particularly Chapter 3, the chapter we're discussing, and made some marginal comments, very brief. Has everybody seen the markup with the maybe half a dozen comments from town manager Brindisi? Basically, his comments just fell into 2 or 3 different categories across the board. One was that credentials of various department heads, he doesn't believe should be in the charter, except for the Board of Health, which are more scientific backgrounds, and he thinks their credentials should be in the charter. So that's a question for us. The couple of places where we talked about reorganizing departments, he believes that's not a charter function. That should be the function of the town manager. It shouldn't be specifically called out in the charter. But those are his comments. And where we were trying to establish credentials, he thinks that's really a human resources function. If we move along in Chapter 3, we talked about the town manager the last time. We soon come to planning. I just wanted to ask a general question on planning. The charter chapter does specifically mention the comprehensive master plan. My question to the commissioners is, to what extent should we put language in the charter requiring adherence to the comprehensive master plan, and by whom? For example, should every decision of the planning board be certified as having been taken and in adhering to the comprehensive master plan? Should every rezoning decision have the same kind of a preamble? What do we think about that? Wrestling, you're shaking your head?
No, I think we really should be getting back to the master plan.
I think we could be a lot stronger in the charter on that point.
Yeah, and I think that, if we mention it in the charter in multiple places, it would show that our intent is to get back to that master plan and to,
I think a suggestion I saw that actually every decision would have that actually built right into the decision. So when the planning board makes a report to town meeting, there'd be a statement at the end about how they had, to their satisfaction, demonstrated that it adheres to the master plan. And if there's an exception and something that doesn't adhere, then they have to explain why. Dave Malaguti, did you want to add something?
The only question I have, and I don't know if anybody here can answer it, but when was the last time that the master plan was updated?
It's being updated right now.
In the process?
it's in the process right
I think it's 14 or 15 years old right now.
Yeah.
Right.
But-
2025 is when it's due, I think.
But if
now.
there,
The current town manager is working on that.
do we have
Planning.
a sense of when the current updating is going to be at least preliminarily completed? It's starting it right now, right? Soon. David, or rather Larry Pizer, is your hand still up?
It is.
Go ahead.
I'm very supportive of what you just said. I think that if we're going to take the master plan seriously, it'll be necessary to have the planning board and the zoning board of appeals to explain and to certify that their decision comports with the master plan. I might take it a step further and to state that they must say how it comports, so that it's not simply boilerplate.
Right.
If we're going to have a master plan, it has to be the master plan. If we're not, we should just drop the subject completely.
I'd like to even suggest we take it a further step. When actions are being taken by different representatives of the town or at town meeting and announced, that the planning board would be expected to stand up and hopefully not being called upon, but they would actually volunteer, stand up and say, in this decision, whatever adheres to the master plan with a statement. In other words, they would be proactive and already have discussed it. And I'm talking about almost every action that would be taken by the executive, and certainly anything to do with land or development by the legislative branch. I think if we did that, I think it would really start putting some meaning into that section.
Mr. Chairman? Hi, I think Betsy had her hand up just before I spoke, so you can go.
I was just going to say, I'm looking at the master plan front page. It says 2004 to 2024. I mean, till 2024. So it's being revised now to be ready, I think, for 2024.
What I was going to say, Mr. Chairman, was that, yes, we need to put some stronger language in the charter referencing this need to do this master planning process. But I want to have something at the completion of the master planning process. I want to have action items, articles, suggestions of bylaw changes to make that charter a reality. We shouldn't be passive where we just plan and wait for something to happen. We need to put together our master plan and then look at our master plan and like, how do we make this a reality? Okay, this is what we're going to have to do. We're going to have to change some bylaws, go to town meeting to make this a reality.
What would be the charter language?
So that's what I'm trying to think about, is that in our charter, we need to make reference to the master planning process, and as a result of it, action items for articles to, this idea that at the end of the planning process, and we have our master plan, we need to have action items that are going to go to town meeting to make that a reality through bylaw changes. Because in the past, what we've done, we all sat in the room in the year 2000. I was there when they were planning, during the planning process in the year 2001 and 2 and 3 and 4. I think Enzo Monti was the chairperson of that planning process. We had a consultant, we had many community, public stakeholder meetings, and we came up with a great master plan. I want to give credit to the planning department because after that, Lee Hartman took the master plan and started to break it down over a 10-year period for each village village committee. He came up with not only a master plan for the town, but he specifically developed master plans for each village of the 5 villages. So he did that. So there was some planning that happened after 2004, well into the 2010 era. But what I'm calling for, just going back to what I initially started to say, is that, yes, we need stronger language about the master planning process. That has to happen, along with the village planning process. But at the end of this planning process, we need to come up with action items that will take the form of articles that go to town meeting that change our bylaws to make these things more likely to happen.
Well, Bill, the charter currently says that the planning board shall develop and maintain a comprehensive master plan, which should be the guidance document, et cetera, et cetera. So we need to see how we're going to change that language to strengthen it, to put in what you were suggesting. We have to actually write the words.
Right. So we would
Right.
we'd have to come up with some language to give a time. We would have to come up with some exact language where we just don't say that they're going to do this planning process. We said every 5 years, kind of like what we did with the voting. We'll have to put into the charter a timeline that every 5 years, every 5 years, they're going to have to come up with this planning.
So Mike and Libby, we want to put, I would say, much more robust language in the charter with respect to the preparation of and function of the master plan, and the fact that once it has been produced, that it will become the basic standard or guideline or framework for all decisions, and which will have, part of them will state the adherence to the master plan. I think you're getting the sense of the commission. So I think is a very important, if not the most important part of the planning chapter.
Mr. Chairman, can I ask a question?
Go ahead, Mike, then David.
My understanding, I missed one meeting a couple meetings ago, and I believe there was some discussion of the master plan task force, which is clearly exists and is, you can see it is current on the website, or it looks to be current, and is referenced in the charter, although only loosely, not in any strong way. I'm curious if any of the commissioners have had further discussions with current members of that committee, how it's operating, what that committee thinks it would be useful for it to strengthen its ability to accomplish some of the things that you're seeking.
Right. It's my understanding that the committee is just getting organized, and I think it's a valid suggestion that at our next meeting, we could have some person who's familiar with the process of what's going on with our master plan committee and where they stand and what the objectives are and where they're going to be delivering. David, wrestling, and then David. Or David, I guess you were first, then wrestling.
Yeah, I'm going to back up and just as.
Steve Bolleton is the chairman.
I was wondering if we should separate the Department of Planning.
Glenn
from the
McGregor is the
Department
vice
of
chairman.
Development, or Economic Development. And the reason I mention that is I've heard from, some people that sometimes there's cross purposes there, that the development people, economic development and whatever, who are out promoting, doing things here in Plymouth, and whether it's a new industrial park or whatever, may be in conflict with planning objectives and preservation of open space and density and so on. So is it a potential internal conflict of interest to have both planning and development in the same department? So I'm just throwing that out to the committee to say, because I think we need to have a robust development group. But as I say, sometimes, I would love the debate between the two of them, the leaders in both. But, there might be an internal conflict of interest by combining them.
Yeah, I think wrestling. Betsy, Bill.
Yes.
So just
Could
to
I
build.
speak, Bill?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to let you know, first of all, that Steve Bolleton is the chairman of the 2022 Master Plan Task Force, and Glenn McGregor is the vice chair. And there's 9 other members, one of which is a representative from the COPC, and one of which is a representative of the Advisory and Finance Committee.
So why don't we invite the chairman to our next meeting?
Yeah, so that would be Steve. And this committee has already been formed, you know, they supposedly met in February. I don't know if they've met since. But there are 2 schools of thought on this, and I tend to one. And that is, some people think that we have too many committees already, and I think we could never have too many committees, that the more people who are involved in democracy, the better. And so I'm thinking in terms of, I remember hearing as a young person, and I still remember, what's everybody's job is nobody's job. Nobody does it. So having a master plan committee whose job it is to oversee the master plan throughout the course of its life, so it doesn't get dropped like a stitch in a you know, so when you're knitting, I think would be very helpful. And I think it would be very focused group. They would have one job to do, and that is to be sure that the master plan, because if you would give it to several groups, the planning board, the select board, the open space committee, et cetera, then it's sort of like nobody's job, and then it doesn't really get done. So that's one possibility. One of the things I love about creating a committee like this is it brings in more people who may not already be involved in helping with town politics. Thank you.
David Peck, the charter currently has a provision, section 14 is the planning board, and it's followed by section 15, which is the director of planning and development. It does speak of planning and development in one section. And I don't think those 2 items should be separated. I do think that together they should form their own chapter, however. They shouldn't be under the select board chapter. But if you read the language, it's rather neutral when it talks about development. It doesn't even use words like economic or tax producing or anything. It just says development, which could be buying open space.
You know, I'm throwing this out for,
Right.
debate by the commissioners, because again, I've heard from more than one person who sometimes think that there's a potential for internal conflict or conflict of
Right.
interest with those 2 objectives.
Sorry, didn't want to.
Yes,
Yeah,
Bill.
okay. I just wanted to build on what you're saying. I've thought about this long and hard over the years, and I think that we have to have a planning and development office focused on planning and development, good planning and development. But we have to have some sort of balance to that reality. And I think that we have to look at the planning department and start thinking about removing some of those conflicts that you have noted. I believe the Conservation Commission should be on its own. I think that the Conservation Commissioner and the Conservation Agent should be an independent entity. In other towns, they are. I think it's a little bit of a conflict to have them under one roof, along with Historical Commission. I think the Historical Commission should have its independence. The Conservation Commission and the Historical Commission find their power from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. They're commissions that have their authority from the Commonwealth. And when you go into some other towns, most other towns, you go and find the Conservation Commission and the Historical Commission out on their own doing their work. And here in Plymouth, we've kind of put a lot of things into the planning office that we might want to relinquish to remove that conflict and then focus them on good planning. Because they should be proactive in looking at the planning process for the town of Plymouth to grow a local sustainable economy. We have to look at development in ways that's going to promote Plymouth, but at the same time, we need to preserve different qualities of Plymouth. And this is another thing that I've been thinking about in the charter, that after 400 years, the town of Plymouth should have a department of preservation, that there has to be some future of place for the Community Preservation Act to be administered from. They have administrative funds to handle their administrative activities. But what I have noted over the last 20 years administering the Community Preservation Act is that every department out there is doing some sort of preservation in some capacity. So this, entity of preservation could not only administer the Community Preservation Act into the future, but also coordinate other preservation acts around the town of Plymouth, coordinating that. The town of Plymouth has invested in a grant writer. There's another example of what the Community Preservation Committee has been doing with different departments over the years, whether it's David Gould's office, some other office, it's about grant writing. So we might want to think about moving these things into an office of preservation, removing the conflict out of planning and development. Let planning and development focus on what it needs to be doing full-time. But I have been thinking about this for some time, and I have spoken to the previous town manager about it, and I have spoken to the current town manager about this idea of, where do we go from here when it comes to preservation for the town of Plymouth, and how do we formalize that and institutionalize that in our charter?
Bill, is CPC even mentioned in the charter? I'm not sure I can find it. Maybe there should be at least a section
Yeah.
for historical and CPC.
I'll start working on this concept that I just kind of put out there.
Yep.
I'll put together a memo for the board and anybody else to look at about this idea that I'm
Right.
touching on, so that people can look at it and make alterations or changes or suggestions. But I think we should explore this to remove what David is starting to gravitate towards, this conflict that might be.
The only concern I would have is you're adding personnel. And that's a concern.
Wrestling, I can't hear you.
You're adding personnel,
Right.
and that's a concern. So, I'm not totally opposed to it, but you're adding personnel so that.
Why do you?
The good news is that the Community Preservation Act does have an administrative fund to hire someone to do that. Now,
There's
the
one, but.
The Community Preservation Committee has been operating now for 20 years, where the volunteers do our minutes and our agendas and put our materials together and do our research and do all that work. But I think at some point we need to, like other towns have, and dedicate a staff to it. They have their admin money to do that. But that would be the first step in this direction of formalizing
Yeah.
this preservation effort. There is a funding
That's
source.
that committee, but
Wrestling, I
the
don't
other
s-
committees you were talking.
Why do you feel that putting a section in that talks about those two functions necessarily adds a person?
Well, but what Bill was talking about is separating a bunch of different.
Well, it's just putting preservation together.
No, this is, the Conservation Commission wouldn't change in its staffing.
Right.
And the same thing wouldn't change with historical. We're not talking about increasing any staff anywhere right now. What we're trying to do is move them into a situation where they're hired directly by the town manager. There's no conflict of who's hiring who and who's overseeing who. There's independence to the commission. There's independence to historical.
But don't those entities share staff at the moment?
In the conservation right now, you have Richard Vaca, who's your conservation agent.
Right, but conservation, historical, and a couple of the other ones.
Yeah. They would continue to utilize the staffing support of administrative people on a certain level. They have people that put together their agendas.
Okay.
They have people that put together their minutes.
Okay.
And so it wouldn't be increasing any staffing. It would
Okay.
just be
No,
reorganizing it.
That was just,
Right.
thank you for the lesson.
Right. Mike, I think if you're following the drift of the conversation, we want to center the master plan in the chapter on planning and have have it actually provide the focus, the center, and the functions. And they would all relate back to the master plan and consistency in following it. I noticed in one of your memos, you talked about the thin, what was your language regarding the master plan codifying the task force more clearly than it currently is, which is pretty thin. Yes, we do want to put more beef on that. And the development of the master plan, and then how it's implemented and how it's followed.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, it was in 314.7 where it allows planning to create the master plan task force, but doesn't really give it, the kind of heft that a lot of other boards and committees do. So I think it would be some value in once we hear from them, and once you hear from them, and what their thoughts are, codifying them in the charter, I think
Right.
could be valuable. And we as a team, because this is, had come up, I think, at the either last meeting or the meeting before, and we had started discussing ways that we could think about building text into the charter to strengthen the master plan in the planning,
Right.
in regular planning process. And one of the, we had thought about, we didn't go so far as saying certifying. That raised us some potential nervousness about, could you be creating legal issues and could you be getting things tied up for years and fighting what certification means? But
I think we
had been
discussed a synonym to certify could be, a non-legal term, like demonstrate adherence to, or it wouldn't have a legalese term like certify. I agree. We don't necessarily need that.
Yeah, and I think, so because the planning board is elected and because you're intending to keep it elected, creating a document trail where people can look and see, is this current planning board constantly overriding the master plan, and why, and what are they saying is why they're doing it, or are they sticking to it? And that creates a political, it creates a way for people to use those pro and con, whichever way they want, to say, we like what the planning board is doing, they're adhering to the master plan, or we like what the planning board is doing, they're being creative and not adhering to it where they see opportunity. So, it allows it as part of the political discussion. So I think they can definitely come up with something, but I'm glad to hear, we were a little nervous about, the idea of including certification, but including, like you said, a preamble or commentary or whatever you call it, with their decisions seems like a good one.
I'd already have reached out to the planning board chairman, exchanged several emails with her, and knows exactly where we're coming from with respect to the master plan, and has already given me some thoughts about language for the charter. I think if we invite the chair plus the chair of the master plan committee to our next meeting, that would be helpful, and you get a sense of where they are in the process. Mr. Pizer.
Two things. One, someone started the conversation by suggesting that conservation and historic district be dropped from the planning department. It later was suggested that they be added to a new department that might come into existence. Want to make sure that people understand that just dropping them from the department and making them independent would be a really bad idea. I was, even 2 or 3 lives ago, the chairman of the Historic District Commission, back when we were independent, and it was not an effective way of acting. So I don't have a problem with moving them to a preservation department, whatever. But the idea of putting them out on their own, I think, would be a mistake. As far as the idea of having a preservation department, we just were discussing the town manager's suggestion that certain parts of the charter be dropped because they don't really belong in the charter. And I'm wondering whether this fits into the same category. The idea of having a division of preservation has merit. But that's probably best left up to.
Say that again, Larry?
That last part, we didn't get.
Repeat the final couple of sentences. You got cut off.
Okay, I'm sorry. The idea that there should be a division of preservation seems like a good idea, but I'm wondering whether that is something that we ought to put into the charter. If it's a good idea, it's something that the town manager ought to have the capability of doing. He's talking about moving all sorts of divisions around from one place to another. And I think that this would be most effectively left in his hands.
Well, we just started talking about this tonight. I think what I heard Bill Cohan suggesting was certainly not its own chapter, but a a section within the chapter that would be devoted to preservation. Right now, I don't think there's any reference to preservation anywhere in the charter. And it would be sort of one of our objectives or functions of our municipal government. And by having a section would be, might be just one way to make recognition of that.
Scott wants to talk.
Scott?
Then Dave.
Just as a note, I'm currently an alternate member on the Historic District Commission, and the problem with removing them from the planning department comes down to when the building department and stuff, when they issue permits. Right now, when they issue the permits, they have to, if it's something within the historic district, whether they're replacing roofs or sidings or windows, then they need to come before the Historic District Commission and make sure that they fit within the guidelines that are established for the historic district. So if we try to move them and put them someplace else, we don't want to lose that disconnect. Because, you know, we've had problems in the past where they get a building permit and they start putting up ASAC or something else that's not appropriate within the historic district, and then all of a sudden somebody tells them they need to come to the Historic District Commission to get approval after they're 3/4 of the way through their project. So with moving them to some type of a preservation, it's not just preservation. You know, it ties into the building department and permits and all that other stuff. So to just completely either remove them, and I'm sure that was probably part of the problem when Larry was on the historic district, if they were standalone at that time, was whether or not they had come before the permits were issued and all that. And you could just be creating a big mess where people start doing work on a building in the historic district, and then all of a sudden the standalone entity is kind of pushing back against something that's already in progress. So that's the one thing I just want to caution with removing them from where they are now or changing them.
Right, thank you,
flow
Bill.
chart.
Yeah, so Scott, I wouldn't be recommending to complicate the situation. I'd want to keep it as streamlined and simple as possible, because the decisions made by the Historical Commission are going to be construction in nature. And we've got to make sure that those orders of conditions that are made by the commission are enforced by inspectional services. So I'm not suggesting that we interrupt that flow of information. What I'm trying to do is kind of build off of what David was saying, where we establish some sort of independence for these committees to operate and function without any conflict. In other towns, they do have that ability. I don't want to send them out independently on, I guess, Larry's concerned about this independence, kind of like have them in down the hallway, without any staff support. I'm not asking for that at all. I think that what we have to do is look at, and I'll work on this to some degree, about this idea of a Department of Preservation and what that might in terms of what that might look like, how it would oversee things, how it would interact with different people, but allow these different departments, allow these different commissions to fully exercise the authority and power that they have in the best interest of the town.
Yeah, it wasn't a negative to that concept. It was just that when we're having this deliberation, we need to take the flow into account as well, so that we don't wind up with them being disjointed. We do want the historic district and other similar commissions to have that
understand
authority, but just as long as it maintains the flow and the continuity within the building
I think the
department.
current proposal is to have a separate section within the planning department. So it would meet your issues, I think, because it would be there still within that department. But right now, it doesn't even exist in the charter. There's nothing. But this would be a section on preservation if it goes forward. A couple more things I want to get to before we move on to another item. One is
Bill, I wanted to speak on this, if that's okay. Sorry. One, we had discussed way back, maybe the planning board should be 7 members, so I just thought I would remind you that we had once discussed that possibility.
which possibility?
Planning board being 7 members. We had discussed that. We said, well, planning board came up, we'd mention it again. I don't know if people are still interested in that. The second thing I want to say is, I don't know, it may not belong in the charter, but I think for a town that has hundreds and hundreds of ponds, rivers, vernal pools, and miles of oceanfront, we need more than one conservation agent. And I'm not sure if that would if in establishing a separate conservation department would help to accomplish that, but this is a town that has many, many people employed in many, many areas, and yet we only have one, person keeping an eye on all of our wetlands, et cetera. So thank you.
Very good, Betsy. In the scheme of things, that probably will come up but in a few weeks, because that's one of those remaining chapters we were going to talk about. The one item that we haven't covered yet was counsel, and I'm talking about legal counsel, lawyers. Just David Peck.
Just another thing within the executive branch, Chapter 3, also looking at other charters, right now, it excludes, the facilities responsibilities are with the town and with school. And it's embedded in all the language that, different departments are responsible except for the schools or vice versa. Other charters, specifically combine the responsibility for buildings into a single municipal department. And that's embedded in their charters. So that is something I would like to both hear from our town manager or select board, if this is something in motion or not, but having two different groups responsible for facilities doesn't make sense to me, and clarifying the responsibility in the charter is something to continue talking about.
If we had, Mike, do you want to comment on that particular point?
Sure, I raised my hand for a prior, couple of
comment.
prior
Go ahead.
points. Did someone want to respond to that first, or?
Well, let's deal with the prior point, then we'll come back to David's point, because I have a comment on David's point as well. Go ahead with your previous comment.
So on the question and the discussion around creating a separate division for preservation and some of the other related comments, although I would say we are generally not particularly in favor of putting department level changes into the charter, this might be a case where using the transition provisions to ask for a study to look into, because the commission could put in the transition provisions the reason that you want to do the study, in light of challenges around preservation, within 3 years or within 2 years or 1 year of the enactment of this charter, the town manager will report, or the board of selectmen report, or whoever, on the preservation functions and whether there is a need for a separate division. We're very hesitant to make department and division level changes in the charter, but certainly recognizing that there are issues and having, asking for a study of them is certainly a good way to keep that discussion going. Same thing, I guess, could be said on facilities. There are plenty of cities and towns that have moved to unified facilities departments, but it is a very complicated and challenging process. And so to really dig into that, we would again suggest, that that's another good topic or I would suggest, I guess I won't speak for the rest of the others on our team. I would suggest that, a transition provision could be written to force a study on whether facilities would be more cost effective, more efficient, more responsive if they were unified. And then I guess the last thing I'll say just quickly while I'm speaking is if the commission could give us some direction of whether you'd like us to begin the process of attempting to carve all of the planning pieces into a separate article, that we can, if that's something you're interested in, we can get working on that.
Mike, let's discuss that last point following the meeting, because we're going to see what you're thinking about putting into a separate article. As far as David Peck's point about the school department and the town, David, all I can say is that the Charter Commission, one that I was on previously, years ago, we spent literally weeks and weeks and weeks trying to do exactly what you proposed. And we had school department people present, and it was probably, talk about being complex. there wasn't, I have to say, at that point, there was no motivation on their side to do it, none. And we had folks like you, and we were, pushing it. It made sense, efficiency. But we spent months, and we really had little to show for it. Whether we want to get engaged again, I think.
Well, all my point is.
At this point, maybe a study during transition is to mention it.
Well, I mention it just because it's embedded in the language. Virtually every sentence, about responsibilities is like, except for the schools, or except for this, and so
No, I agree.
we either go one way or the other, or we sort of put it in the transition study thing, because I noticed Amherst and maybe some of the other recent ones do create studies for 2 or 3 issues as part of the transition, so.
I remember the big one was whether the buildings should all be part of a single division, school buildings and town buildings.
Right.
And it sounds pretty simple,
Yeah,
but it wasn't when we started
No,
digging into it.
but it should be, but anyway.
So are you suggesting that we should look at that, where the facilities of the operation of the town is under one?
Yes, but in a way that's not, in some ways, it's separate from the charter,
Right.
because it may be sort of an operational thing for
Right.
the town, what makes sense. But, I bring it up in part because I reread everything, and there's just a lot of language that presumes they're separate.
Right.
And we either keep that language, or we combine them,
Okay.
or we put it, we just need to figure out
Right.
what the charter says,
We-
one
we-
way or
we
the
do-
other.
We should spend some time talking about that, because it is a massive issue in this town. It's getting in the way of making decisions. People keep throwing up in the air, the town can't do these things, and we need to prove they can. They can, and they are. And how we clarify that language to intensify that, that's a very big issue in this town right now.
All right. Let's just mention the use of legal counsel. There's one point in the Collins memorandum, last one, about legal counsel. We discussed it, and they came back with a proposal, very simple. It just would say that not less than every 3 years, the select board shall review the appointment of legal counsel. If we want to add to that, or leave that in,
I would like to add to that.
go ahead.
That they would, that there will be a public hearing, at least, during that 3-year period of time, there'll be a public hearing. But as a result of that hearing, the Board of Selectmen have to vote to continue using that counsel or instruct the town manager to.
What would happen during the public hearing?
Well, this is the thing that this suggestion was something that I had been making the thought was this, that right now we have town council, and we have no review of the quality of that work over a period of time. It just sits there as town council, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. What I would like to try to do in the charter is that we are asking that every 3 years, there has to be a public hearing where the town manager presents the performance of town council, what it's cost, what information can be available during that public hearing to determine whether they were happy with that council, will continue to use that council, or instruct the town manager to start exploring different options. So my point is, it's a canary in the coal mine. At some point, town council, the subject matter ends up in a public hearing, and people are talking about it, seeing the results of council's work, and then continuing with that council or making a decision to explore other options. But I think that language should be expanded right now we're just saying that there will be a public hearing every 3 years. The selectmen will entertain a public hearing with the town manager on the performance of council. At the end of that hearing, there'll be a decision to vote to either move forward with council or instruct the town manager to explore other options. So there is some accountability with everybody, that council knows that when they are operating within the town, that they know they're not just beholden to the town manager or the selectmen, but they're also beholden to the people of Plymouth. So that as they make their decisions, they're reflecting on that as time passes. Because I think there's been some concern in the past that council tends to render opinions to keep their client comfortable.
Scott?
When we began the discussion, I was an advocate for in-house counsel, of the town having an in-house counsel to, at the very least, triage all of their issues and see what required, forwarding to other specialized types of counsel. But I completely agree with Billy on this one. If it's just simply a line that says, every 3 years, they're gonna review it, they could take 2 minutes to do it with no transparency. So where Billy's advocating for a public hearing, where they could discuss how many billable hours. Obviously, they can't get into work product, or they can't get into the factual basis of what they have done. But at the very least, we can find out, how many billable hours did we spend on counsel. At some point, they're going to figure out that it's cheaper to have in-house counsel to, at the very least, triage it or deal with small matters. And that's what I've always been in favor of, is in-house counsel. But on Billy's idea of transparency and having, the public know, how many hours of billable work they've done in what, even if it's just in broad, whether it's labor or whether it's, other matters, if they can break it down, that would go a long ways towards transparency in government.
Scott, on that point, remember there was a couple of charters we reviewed. It was one of the ones I remember I read that had a whole paragraph on town council and what kind of a report it would make, presumably at a public hearing. And I will furnish that to you between now and the next meeting, because it's a lot of the language we're talking about. It's already been crafted. Had to say how many opinions they've rendered and so forth.
I think Billy's idea of transparency is important.
Wrestling?
Yeah, part of our past discussion was on if there's any way, because part of to Scott's discussion of having in-house counsel is there's times when COPC or other groups need
Right.
to get, to that council. And I remember COPC was going through something, and the chair went to town management and said, hey, we need to get, town council. And they're like, well, it's gonna cost $700 a minute to do that.
Right.
So I think that should be some discussion upon how we can make town council or in-house counsel available to some groups that
Okay.
need it.
David?
I'm not sure where it belongs in the charter and our discussion, but term limits is something.
Yeah, we're gonna come to that, right.
Yeah, whether that's in elections, I'm not sure which chapter it comes in,
I
but,
was going to bring that up when we go through our checklist.
yeah, okay,
It's on there.
because that's
Right.
an important topic.
Yep. Yeah, Betsy?
Also, Larry Piza also has his hand up. I agree that we need something very definitive, nothing ambiguous, where it's just like, yeah, we glanced at that. I'm wondering about the possibility of having a report in the town report, a written report in the town report from the select board, a couple of paragraphs about the cost of town council, what they've been doing. I'm not sure what that report would look like, but I do know that there are, we do have a town report, and many people do, spend quite a bit of time with it. So maybe not only would we have this public hearing, but then there would be some sort of a provision for it to be placed in the town report.
So before we leave this point, Mike, there is language in a couple of these other charters that have sort of a report card in town council periodically, but town council would present what it's been doing, how many opinions it's rendered, and that sort of thing. If you can't find, I've read it in a couple of charters I reviewed, presumably you could find that language for council. Mr. Pizer, is that your hand? Or, go ahead. Go ahead, Larry.
Oh, I'm sorry. As with most things, it's not the select board who employs town council, it's the town manager. And once again, I've had favorable relations with some town managers and less favorable relations with other town managers. But I like the idea of having the town manager defend his choice, but I would be very careful about removing control of council from a single authority, from the town manager. It's a very expensive proposition to have town council. If we don't like the job that the town manager is doing, we should work at getting a new town manager. But I'd be very nervous about taking control of council away from the town manager. Thank you.
Okay? Leslie?
Just towards this, I think that this is an important part of checks and balances. Just an example, the COPC, back when we had the clicker problems, COPC really wanted town management to look into the company that provided those clickers. And they said, yeah, well, we haven't got a lot of options. And they came back with the price that they charge us every town meeting, which was fairly large. And you know, towards that, I think that more checks and balances of this type, you know, are important, because I think that, you know, other branches of the government need to be able to say, all right, you know, can we review the clicker people? Can we review, you know, because I think it's important to constantly be looking at who we employ and how we employ them and how much and how they're doing.
Right, very good. So we definitely we should cover this. It, being 8:30, let's begin our public comment. Please limit your comments to 5 minutes. You're welcome to make a public comment. And just please sign the register there. Thank you.
Good evening, can you hear me? There we go. Precinct 2. Good evening, I'm Tom Pinto, taxpayer, ratepayer, North Plymouth Steering Committee member, Insurance Advisory Chair, educator, President of the Education Association of Plymouth and Carver, spokesman for the Coalition of Organized Plymouth Employees, and Chairman of Precinct 2. I'm here to speak to the Charter Commission regarding a proposal to ban town employees from the oldest form of government, town meeting. I want to thank Mrs. Hall, my former guidance counselor, Mr. Vecchi, and Mr. Pizer for their well-spoken statements against banning town employees from town meeting. If we start banning people from participating in our town government, where does it end? Which group will be next? Last Thursday at your meeting, there was discussion that unions are perceived by the community to be strong-arming town meeting to our will. If that concern was real or true, then why would my father and myself been the two top vote getters for Precinct 2, despite not putting out a yard sign or campaigning? As Mr. Vecchi said on Thursday, it's because town employees don't live in a vacuum. They've invested interest in the town they live in and work in. I may not be a descendant of a pilgrim, but my family came to Plymouth over 100 years ago to work in the cordage factory, and we continue to live in the same neighborhood. We have strong roots to this town. Besides for being a union member, I'm also a neighbor, a parent of a student of Plymouth Public Schools, the president of the Young America Club, the guy who for years worked Sundays at Perry's Market, and someone who loves to participate in the auction at the Holy Ghost, and much more. I love my town and chose it as a place I wanted to work in, raise my family in, and give back to the community. Should I be denied the same rights as every other town resident because I work for the town? How do I explain to my fellow employees that if you live in this town, you do not have the same rights as other town residents? Should America's hometown be known as the town that closed its doors to town employees? Tell them they can work here, they can live here, but they're not good enough to have their voice in their town's government. Moving forward, I hope we can all work together, agreeing and respectfully disagreeing when needed with each other to help propel our town forward. If change is needed, we allow the voters to decide. Thank you.
Thank you. Michelle, is there further public comment?
Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. Like the tech guy. All right, for those who don't know me, thank you for having me, by the way. Brian Baragwanath, Precinct 2, newly elected to Precinct 2. This past election, I just voted in my first town meeting. I represent the Plymouth Firefighters Union, 133 members, in addition to representing Precinct 2 townspeople. In addition to doing that, I'm a member of COPE with Mr. Pinto. I also served 4 years in the Marine Corps, and I've been on the job here in Plymouth for 15 years. Never once in the 15 years I've been a firefighter did I ever get sent to a call and differentiate and say, well, I'm going to treat this person differently than I'm going to treat this person. And I'm going to do the same thing on town meeting. Never once on town meeting will I treat people differently, like it was presumed last week. And I don't have a heck of a lot of prepared statements here, but I thought it was important to speak on a few things. I thank you guys and respect this committee for what you're doing and attempting to do. Unfortunately, I feel as a town employee from some of you that respect is not mutual. And that was stated pretty clearly last week when you want to take away constitutional rights, the right to serve on town meeting, oldest form of government we have from the 1630s, away from me. We went through this in 2014, I remember. Section 268A, Mass General Law 268A, Section 1G, specifically states elected members of a town meeting are specifically excluded from the definition of municipal employee. We've been down this road before, and over the 8 years in between when we fought this same thing, town meeting has run just fine, and never once have we influenced an election. I believe that being a town meeting member takes integrity, which is why I can be entrusted by my neighbor to work for the town and also vote on interests for them and potentially not be the interest for me because I'm representing them. There's a stark difference between what I do as a firefighter and what I do as a town meeting member. Unlike Mr. Pinto, I haven't been here for 100 years. When I got out of the Marine Corps in 2007, I chose to come here, and I'm ingrained in North Plymouth. I talk to the people in North Plymouth. I walk my dog all over the streets up until a few months ago when he passed away, rest his soul. I live right down the street from you. I see you all the time, Mr. Malaguti. I talk to people in the community. I'm part of the community. I'm not just somebody who's attempting to pursue an agenda for 133 people who work in the town. If that was the case, I would be getting rich here. I have a passion for what I do. I think we need more people to see that town workers are not the enemy. We shouldn't be looked down the nose at. As a few things were brought up last week, one of which being that what precipitated some of this comments was a couple of committee of precinct chairs were unseated. That's democracy. That's what we do. We had 9 new members voted in. You had new chairs voted in 2 precincts that were brought up last week, precincts 2 and 3. That's the right way to do things. That's how we do things. We're not doing anything out of the realm as town workers or as town meeting members or as residents for that matter. I just think we're really overreaching what this commission is doing if we're going to entertain constitutional rights. I think we have attorneys here that understand that there's definitely some pretty significant legal challenges, and quite frankly, I'm a little bit, I'm disheartened that we would even entertain it here, that we're going to take away constitutional rights from town employees. So in closing, I want to thank you for having me, but I feel that what was brought up last week, that maybe we do have cliques in the town, and maybe they're not from the town workers like it was presumed. Or maybe we have other instances where people shall recuse themselves as well for many, many matters that is far-reaching tentacles of. And I think to use this commission to attack town employees, town residents, is, like I said, disheartening, a little bit despicable. So I want to thank you, and I hope that, I hope you guys reconsider and really think about the impact that it has on the community by entertaining, limiting the rights of people in the community. Thank you.
Before we have further public comment, I just want to make one responsive comment to the two that we just heard. At our meeting last week, we listened to a citizen of Plymouth, unsolicited, who decided to come down here and speak, and we're not afraid of listening to anyone. Anybody who wants to speak to this commission can certainly speak to the commission of their views about our municipal government. And yes, he did put forth a proposition where town meeting members could not include employees. All we did was listen. There was no motion made. I don't believe there was any support expressed, at least in my listening, to that particular proposition. And in fact, it was even pointed out by our consultants whether or not it was even legal. So that's all we hear. That's all we did was listen to something that was presented, and we're happy you're here tonight. We're happy to hear from you as well. But there's nothing currently in the charter or being suggested for the charter that would prohibit town employees from being town meeting members.
Well, thank you, but I must make a comment that my group was definitely slandered. Once this was discussed, they were talked about that we've bullied people off town meeting. We were talked about that we've, in addition, boycotted businesses. All these rumor and innuendo was brought up about, and told that the person who brought it up, which was premeditated, had guts for bringing it up. So it was not brought up by you, but it was certainly entertained by members here, and that's what brought that comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the commission. For the record, my name is Dale Weber. I'm a town meeting member approaching 30 years and was recently elected to the chair position of Precinct 3, a precinct that I'm honored to represent, as Precinct 3 is, after all, where it all began. All of this began Precinct 3. I'm going to submit to your administrative assistant 9 copies of some paperwork. I won't get into the crux of it, but prior speaker Brian Baragwana brought up the issue that we discussed all this back in 2014, and we discussed it not as to the format as to whether a town employee should be allowed to serve on town meeting, but it was in the context of a conflict of interest, and there was a subcommittee formed from the Committee of Precinct Chairs, and there was quite active debate about that. The letters I've submitted to you are a letter from Mr. David Wilson in response to me, based in 2014, on whether or not there was a conflict of interest from town employees serving in town meeting. His letter will speak to itself. I don't need to speak for him, but the eventuality was that he opined that not only can town meeting members serve as town meeting representatives, they can vote on a financial interest that is of importance to them, should they choose to do so. And you can read that at your own leisure, and you can see the letter that I also sent to town meeting members regarding Mr. Wilson's comments. And it was ironic that he spoke to the speaker that came in here last week and basically made a request for this commission to ask the Collins Center, as well as your town council, to look at the possibility of excluding town employees from town meeting. Now, we all know that the existing charter does not establish any prerequisite to serve as a town meeting member. The only prerequisite is you have to be a registered voter in the town of Plymouth. To that end, there is therefore no prerequisite for a town meeting member to serve on a town meeting committee. I've served on many through the years, and recently I was elected as a chairman of Precinct 3. Now, I have to make this comment to you specifically, Mr. Abbott, because following up on Mr. Baragwana, there was discourse last week, and in that discourse about the recent replacement of two long-serving precinct chairs, including Mr. Cohen, who I've served with for many years in Precinct 3, that even you, Mr. Abbott, agreed that, well, we have town employees at town meeting, but to bring them into another level of committee of precinct chairs is another level of responsibility, and maybe this requires a look at. So that was a comment you made last week. And Mr. Cirque, the speaker that came in from the public last week, did add that he wanted you to engage the Collins Center and town council to get a legal opinion on whether or not town employees can serve. So the bottom line here is, and I don't want to repeat what comments have been made prior to me tonight, but we are, as town employees, I'm actually not a town employee anymore. I do represent town employees. I'm retired. I served my sentence of 38 years and 9 months with the town. And the bottom line is we are all very much invested in the town of Plymouth, in the community, and as frontline employees, we see certain things that other people that are not frontline employees see. We see room for improvement. We bring those issues forward, not in a manner to make them a conflict of interest, but to make improvements. So please consider where we go. And you know what? If you're going to consider limiting town employees, please look at other groups that consist of a certain population in the town meeting process. I heard Ms. Hall, and I also want to thank Ms. Hall, Mr. Pizer, and Mr. Vecchi for their comments last week. They were very well received by us in a tumultuous discussion. But I didn't hear Ms. Hall say that someone did a breakdown of the number of town employees at town meeting being 17, which equals a 10% makeup of the vote at town meeting. I won't argue that, but I will say that as some of my fellow town meeting members are members of other larger organizations, such as the Chamber of Commerce, there's an organization that has a lot of interests that they look out for. And there are lawyers and there are bankers, and my letter that I've included to you for your leisure reading outlines those other groups. And we all work together, and that's what it is. And I think that all of us working together creates that diversity that makes things work in Plymouth. I do want to compliment Mr. Vecchi's comments about the danger of that he perceived and that I share, that if you continue to go down this rabbit hole by excluding certain classes of people, where does it end? As a municipal employee, are we not worthy of serving? What is the litmus test that shall be designed to become a town meeting member? And if there is such a litmus test, I will happily take that test. But I want you to really give some thought to what was stated. I believe we have been down this road before. You came up with some language that's currently existing. The speaker that came in here last week, I figure it was my opinion that his recommendation to you was on the radical side. Included in my paper tonight, I made an equally radical suggestion to the committee. It's on the last page of the packet, and I'll read it to you here now. I ask you to consider one change to your charter, one amendment, and that is under Section 10 of the Conflict of Interest. Just add the words in the preamble, if you will, quote, as defined in Mass General Laws, Chapter 268A. That's it. Add that definition, because right now, your current language of 2-10-1, 2-10-2, and 2-10-3 are unenforceable, have not been added to the state's conflict of interest law, and only serve to confuse the reader of the charter as to what is what, who is who. And I believe that Mr. Wilson's letter of 7 years ago outlines that. And I also want to leave you with this. Mr. Wilson is, when he wrote that letter, he was the Legal Division Deputy Chief of the Ethics Commission. Today, he is the Executive Director of the State Ethics Commission. So you can all contact him and ask about his opinion 8 years ago, and you'll find that it has not changed. So thank you for your time this evening. I appreciate being able to come up and rebut some prior comments.
Thank you, Mr. Weber. Any? What are you pointing to? Oh, Joe, Mr. Hutchinson, do you wish to speak, public comment?
I do, Mr. Abbott.
You're welcome. Go ahead.
I wanted to talk about the master plan, since you folks had a somewhat lengthy conversation about it. As it turns out, Plymouth's master plan proper is a comprehensive plan, and the steering committee plans that kind of live underneath it are the master plans that have actual action items. Now, in a prescribed master plan, in other towns, you'll find often an entire chapter dedicated to an action plan. And what that includes is the municipal entity, whether it's the select board, planning board, conservation commission, whatever it is, responsible for a given task that occurs over the course of time. And, you know, these master plans are pretty robustly prescribed by the state, and most plans follow them, often adding their own chapters depending on the unique requirements. The one I'm familiar with had Devon's as a unique requirement. All that said, master plans tend to sit on the shelf unless those responsibilities are taken seriously, and they aren't taken seriously unless they're written into job descriptions. And so what I would like to see is, and I wish Frank were here, Frank and I think, agree on this. Somehow or another, the language in the job description of the select board that actually makes them responsible and those responsibilities enforceable. And, you know, I'd ask the Collins folks to come up with language like that if that's possible. I'm sure this is not the only place in the Commonwealth where this kind of a problem persists. So also commenting on the progress so far of our master plan. Right now, they are doing, well, the steering committee is doing a gap analysis. I would have hoped that they'd be a lot further along in surveying the town, discussions with stakeholders, actually hiring a consultant. And in fact, because building a master plan takes a long time, takes multiple years. And usually you break it down into phases. It costs a lot. The consultants that you hire cost a lot. We would, for example, have a pretty expensive consultant to just do the chapter on travel and on transportation. If you can imagine what that might look like and feel like. Because of the complexity of our water transportation, as well as our road transportation, as well as our state roads, as well as town roads, as well as unclaimed roads for that matter. So I would want the responsibility for the implementation of that master plan spelled out. And as I say, there are frequently implementation plans in other master plans around the Commonwealth, so it'd be relatively easy to do. I'd also, if you're going to have master plan representatives in here next week, discuss the complexities of having a comprehensive plan and a set of plans per village, because it's a little complex, but I think it's kind of a good idea. But it also needs probably some level of inspection with respect to the job descriptions, et cetera.
Joe,
the,
your prescribed time is up. I just have a question. Are you currently a member of the master plan committee?
No, I just know about master plans.
They will be here next week, so we hope that you will be able to perhaps join us next week.
Oh, of course, I will. Yeah.
So if you want to make, why don't you, do you have
Can I take 2 more minutes?
less than a minute to conclude?
The role of the COPC in town meeting, I think it's complicated, and I haven't seen any language about what how the town meeting per se interacts with the COPC that is representing it. And so I'd like to see some language around that detail. I'd also like to ask about ask the Collins for would it be a request from the board or the commission rather to actually ask the Collins folks about language for my proposal for a communications and community engagement department, if that's okay with you folks.
Right.
I would like to talk to them about the language for that. And I'd also like to hear any ideas that they might have on land banks, which is an idea that I would like to explore.
So, so Joe, we'll tell you as soon as those things are on our agenda, so you can join. You'll be here for that discussion to hear how it goes. That is on the list of to-do items that we've asked Collins to look at, the communications chapter.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your comment. Any other questions? Any of our public comments? So who are you pointing to? Is it Christofori?
Yes, it is.
Yes, go ahead. Welcome.
Well, I would hope that the commission seriously continues to debate the value of increasing the number of board members to 7. I believe 7 members would mean more ideas that could be debated concerning a particular issue. I also believe in regional representation such that concerns would be voiced from other areas of towns, then debated to make the best choice for the town. Presently, in my opinion, this really doesn't seem to be happening. My other topic would be, and I know it's kind of been debated amongst some of the commission members, and I know some of them may roll their eyes, but I strongly believe in term limits for the select board. And my feeling is that if at the federal level, it's good enough for the executive branch to have term limits, I think it should be at the town level as well. And when I say term limits, I mean 2 consecutive 3-year terms and then sit out a term and then run again. I believe this allows for other people to come in and have with fresh ideas instead of having just consecutive the same person over and over again. And the reason that happens is, like you know as well as I do, when some people go to vote, they don't really read what this person may stand for. They go by name recognition. So that's one thing that I would hope that you would also take into consideration. Thank you for your time. That's it.
Thank you, Mr. Christofori. Actually, as I mentioned a minute ago, term limits is on our list. We'll probably be discussing those items next week. I don't think we have time tonight, but there are several aspects of term limits we're talking about here, from town meeting members to planning board members to select board members. So it will be an interesting discussion.
Very good. Thank you.
Any further comment? Any further public comment?
There is one question on a chat from Ginny Davis. She's asking, does a town employee recuse if they have a conflict?
Say that one more time?
Ginny Davis asked a question on the chat. Does a town employee recuse if they have a conflict?
Did a town employees recuse?
Recuse themselves if they have a conflict.
If they have a conflict, yes. The sections in our charter that deal with conflict of interest, and I thank Mr. Weber for his research and so forth. We've seen this letter before, but and we've had this discussion, Dale, probably a dozen times, back and forth. I mean, I certainly do believe that the town of Plymouth's conflict of interest provisions exist independently and separately from what is going on at the state level. So we do have conflict of interest provisions in our charter that do apply, for sure, to town meeting members. We've had legal counsel tell us that when we put them in the charter, and I think it's been true ever since. You're also right that there is no specific enforcement provision specifically stated in the charter. The enforcement of our charter generally is going to be a topic we're going to probably take up at our next meeting, some kind of enforcement for various provisions of the charter. But we're very cognizant of what the State Ethics Commission rules and how they apply and who's a municipal employee and so forth. But those are the state conflict of interest rules. And under the Home Rule Charter, Town of Plymouth is perfectly legally competent to pass and develop its own conflict of interest rules. It as a higher standard from what is already in play at the state level. I mean, this now goes back 20 years. We're getting quite a body of legal research at this point. But as far as the question goes, Michelle, yes, anyone who has a conflict, whether it's a town employee, a lawyer, a realtor, anybody in business, anybody who has an interest in a piece of real estate, all of those people could have a potential conflict of interest and should recuse themselves from a vote if it deals with that interest. Any other, Betsy?
Yes, I would like to speak to something a little bit different, but along the same line, and that is all the committees that I have been on, Energy Committee, the Sand and Gravel Committee, the Open Space Committee, nobody has ever asked me if I have completed a conflict of interest form. And that's a state law. Every 2 years, everyone has to complete a conflict of interest training and then provide a certificate. And I have been to the town clerk, I've been to the town manager, and I've said, who is, enforcing this, and where are those certificates? I want to see the certificates for the Conservation Commission, or I want to see the certificates for the Select Board even. Oh, we don't know where those are. And I think we need to reinforce that. I think that's even a greater, much greater worry for me as a resident. The planning board is anybody on the planning board voting for things that will affect their own finances. And is every member of the planning board, I'm not picking on the planning board, but we happen to be discussing them tonight. But every single elected or appointed committee in the town of Plymouth, every person has got to,
So Betsy, where
complete.
does it say who is supposed to actually fill out this form?
It's right online, it's right at the state.
No, it could be online. No, who is this in the state statute?
Yes, it's a whole conflict of interest. There's 2 trainings that everyone has to complete, the open meeting law training and the conflict of interest training.
But see, that's inconsistent.
Everybody.
That's inconsistent with Mr. Weber's argument and with the state statute, which says that town meeting members at the state level.
Except town meeting members, that's what I'm talking about.
It doesn't
I'm saying
apply
I
to
want
them.
to change the subject from town meeting members to every other appointed and elected board and committee in Plymouth.
And
There
the
is
other
a
thing, Betsy,
state
I
law.
want to say, you don't have a conflict of interest until a specific situation arises. What
There's
we
a
want
state
town-
law.
What we want town meeting members to do is before there's a specific vote that affects them personally, for whatever
I'm changing the
reason.
subject entirely, Bill. I'm totally off town meeting. I'm saying but we're talking about conflict of interest, but I'm totally off the town meeting part of it. I want to discuss the fact that maybe we need some place in our charter that there's somebody who is absolutely responsible, maybe it's the town clerk, although the town clerk is very busy, so maybe it's somebody else, that makes sure that every member of the planning board, every member of the energy committee, every member of every committee, including our select board, has completed both the open meeting law training as well as, and that probably, if we're going to have a conflict of interest section of town meeting, they should be completing the conflict of interest training too. But we are completely derelict, I think, in our duty in this town of making sure that everybody has completed a conflict of interest certificate. David just showed me his, and we all did one. No, I think everyone here did a conflict of interest and open meeting law training at the beginning. I know I did, but nobody asked me for it, you know, so maybe we need to put in the charter that the chairman of every committee and board will have the responsibility of making sure that every member of their committee or board completes and gives them. Now, when I was the chairman of the Open Space Committee, I hounded the other members of the Open Space Committee. You can't serve on this committee unless you give me a open meeting law certificate and a conflict of interest. But there's almost no attention whatsoever. So we've spent all this time on conflict of interest for town meeting. I think we also need to look on an even more important topic, and that is every board and committee in this town is required by state law to every 2 years complete the training for conflict of interest in open meeting law.
We should probably discuss that. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman? Yeah. No, I was just going to build on what Betsy Hall is talking about, and that is something that the town used to host. The town used to go down 11 Lincoln Street, open up the front door, go into the Great Hall, they'd bring in council, they'd invite everybody to come in, they'd have 30, 40 people there, and they would give the training session. So the town used to offer this to newly appointed, newly elected people that in July, everybody gets appointed and sworn in May, June, committees are appointed, and then in July, they used to offer this, the town would sponsor council to come in and give a training session right there and give everybody the paperwork, and they would spend 2 hours and get the lesson and walk out. We used to do it years ago, and I think we need to go back to that. I know everybody likes to do Zoom and do everything online, but it should be 2 options given.
Thank you.
I will say, in my own notes, thank you, Betsy, for bringing this up, but my own notes, I had it as potentially, at the time of an oath of office, the new candidate needs to present those 2 certificates, as well as being sworn in.
I don't know if you wouldn't have enough time, I don't think you could do that. I'm just saying.
Well, I'm just trying to find a way to emphasize, reinforce the importance of it.
Well, the open meeting law
I
doesn't
think all
apply
of this
to
is a
town meeting.
discussion for when we talk about this.
No, it doesn't, but on the other hand, all the appointed committees and so on, we're just finding a way to, whether it's on the chairman or whether it's, a mix of things, we need to reinforce that, because we certainly get that periodically as members of committees, but just, the enforcement is inconsistent.
So we'll think of a place to put it in the charter. Right, got it. Any other comment?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Larry.
This is actually a state law, and I'm wondering whether the town needs to get involved. But to answer the question, historically, the certificates have gone to the Human Resources Department. Right now, the process is online. I've taken this training. It's not a statement that a person doesn't have a conflict of interest. It's a statement that a person understands the conflict of interest law. Under that circumstance, it doesn't really seem to be something that we need to put in the charter. It's something that we need to talk with management. If management is interested in making sure that all of the people involved do understand conflict of interest laws, but the laws, the training, and I think most of you have seen this if you've done the training, pretty general training about the concept of conflict of interest and how to avoid having problems. But if you do have a question, as of now, the information does go to the Human Resources Department once someone has completed this training. Thank you.
But Larry, we've talked about perception and emphasis of conflict of interest. I don't certainly see any harm in having that, even if it's not necessary, but putting it in the charter to anybody who reads our charter that sees that, we're certainly very aware of this particular issue and matter, and the charter just as a statement that they will be educated in that, what is conflict of interest. It's kind of like the town moderator reading the rules at the beginning of the town meeting. Again, telling people what the conflict of interest is all about.
Mr. Chairman, I just, this wasn't on the agenda, so I wasn't prepared to talk about it, so I think we should,
Okay.
when we get to
When we get to
conflict
it.
of interest, I think that's a great discussion.
It's been
but-
lurking, however. Okay, Michelle, are there any minutes to approve tonight?
Last week in your packet was the June 9th.
So we have the June 23rd minutes,
No, June 9th.
June 9th. That's right, we didn't approve the June 9th at our last meeting.
Motion to accept.
Is it seconded?
Second.
Motion to approve and accept the
I
minutes of
have
June
discussion.
9th.
I have one change I'd like to see made. On page 9, under Betsy Hall, at the top, it says, "Agreed with Mr. Brewster
So you want to completely take that out?
that this sounds like council, but this discussion concerns only the election process of the select board, not the function of the select board." Because the rest of that sentence doesn't really make sense to me, so
So what's the?
take out the rest of that and just put in, "This discussion concerns only the election process of the select board, not the function of the select board."
Michelle, did you get that?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. With that correction, all in favor of approval of the June 9th minutes? They're approved, except David, you're abstaining, and David abstains. Two Davids abstain, right? Is there any old business? Any new business?
Mr.
David.
Chairman, input from individual committees. I mean, I'm speaking because my wife is chair of the Open Space Committee, but
Right.
there's Building Committee, there's other committees that are outlined, and will we get a chance for input from each of those
Yes, I
committees
think we need
with
to.
suggestions?
You just mentioned open space, and I
Right.
think open space is absolutely good. Also, the chair of the Land Use and Acquisition Committee has approached me, same idea.
Right,
So I think we should set that aside maybe in a couple of weeks.
okay.
I agree.
Yeah, good, just,
Maybe we should
don't
be
want it
listing
forgotten.
the committees that we need to ask about. But those are two committees right there that we need to talk to.
Yeah.
Any further, I guess that was new business. Any other new business? So
Motion
next
to
meeting
adjourn?
Is 2 weeks from. Tonight? It is actually July 11th, a week after, 1 week from July 4th. We have two meetings in July, which are the 11th and the 18th, both Monday nights. 7:30. On the 11th, 7:30 on the 11th. There'd be no further business, but.
Motion
we
to
thank-
adjourn, Mr.
thank,
Chairman.
the Collins team for being here tonight. Thank you very much. And a motion is in order to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
All in favor? We're adjourned. Thank you.